Hello, I am Ngamisile Pamela Ngubane, and this is the Entity Dynamics podcast. This is part 2 of my Communism, a Parasite Dream episode. And in this episode, I'm going to be looking at separate development and why it should have been given a chance. So Entity Dynamics is a culture development consultancy, and we work with social and civic organizations as well as commercial businesses to inculcate the organizational culture of those organizations and businesses into the communities the organizations work with and the employees of those businesses. At Entity Dynamics, we believe that culture creates behavior and behavior creates reality. And so in order to change a society's reality, we have to change a society's culture. So as I said in part 1, I had been advocating all along for the creation of a national culture in South Africa so that we could all come together and do what we needed to do to save our country, to grow its economy, and to be united as a society where, we're all working together, we trust each other, we respect each other, and we're all doing what we can to make this country awesome. And then I said, actually, that if we couldn't achieve this, then we would have to look at the policy of separate development because then we should be free to not have to live with people that we can't agree with on very important social issues, and how to formulate economic policy for our country. So I want to talk about separate development and why separate development is an option. Now, I'm not talking about, the apartheid policy of people living in Bantustans and, having to carry passes in order to come into South Africa and work in the economy there. What I am saying is that we need to separate from communism. Communism does not help anyone. It's never helped anyone. It's destructive. It's never worked. And this is why it requires the establishment of a culture of dishonesty in order to hoodwink people into believing that it's actually possibly a viable option as the foundation on which people base policy decisions, right? So it also requires a culture of victimhood. And this is what you see in critical theory, the oppressor-oppressed dichotomy, which has been so well capitalized on by the ANC government, allowing it to constantly evade criticism and accountability for what it's done. Like I said, Global South, Black, oppressed people are supposed to just be given the benefit of the doubt by everyone. And this is what the West fell into. It fell into this trap of thinking, and that's why it retreated from its colonies. It retreated from its colonies, yes, also because financially they were a huge burden, and after World War II, they couldn't maintain them. But there was also an ideological retreat. It wasn't just a physical retreat or a financial retreat. There was also an ideological retreat. There was a retreat in seeing itself as the paragon of civilization and as a source of culture, positive culture for the rest of humanity, right? So in this retreat, it also then succumbed to the pressure to begin to censure and put under pressure the governments of South Africa under the National Party and Rhodesia under the Rhodesia Front to allow for Black majority rule in those countries. And South Africa at that point was also administering Southwest Africa, which is today called Namibia. So as the West was retreating ideologically from its dominance in the world stage, the white people of Rhodesia, the white people of South Africa said, no, we're not going to retreat, because they could see the communism that was manipulating the West. And they knew what communism had done. And they could see what communism had done in other countries in Africa, like Ghana, Tanzania, Ethiopia after the deposed Haile Selassie, and they didn't want it to happen in South Africa and in Rhodesia. I mean, they had built the economies and the institutions of state of those countries. They weren't just going to give them up to Black people who were not ready to take them over because they hadn't been trained to take them over, and B, Black people who were communists who were going to, by default, undermine those economic institutions, because communists are not, and they don't understand economics, and in many respects, economics is just accepting that capitalism is how economies work. Trade is the basis of economic activity, while production and production without trade becomes subsistence, right? If you're not trading it, you're just using it for yourself, and that's okay. But if you're producing a surplus but you're not trading it, what happens? It just becomes waste. It's a waste of productive capacity, right? So separate developments. Now I'm going to just focus on South Africa, but it's very similar to what was going on in Rhodesia under the Rhodesia Front led by Ian Smith. In South Africa, what the Afrikaners said when they came to power in 1948 was that we and the Bantu people and the Khoi and San people, we are very different culturally, and we can't live together culturally because we are not compatible. We are going to clash. It's going to create tension, and that tension is going to create conflict. So rather let the Bantu and the San and Khoi people live in their own areas, practice their cultures, but let us then begin by giving them their own countries in the Bantustans to administer. Let us give them the ability to develop Western social, political, and economic institutions of state, which will then teach them and enable them to integrate into a Western capitalist civilization, all the while maintaining their customs, their cultural customs, because your cultural customs don't have to succumb to Western capitalism. It has nothing to do with how you produce and how you become economically active and how you industrialize, right? These are just scientific objective undertakings. 1 + 1 = 2 there. Obviously maybe how you interact at a social level in terms of what you do with the money that is created by your capitalist economic activity will be then tempered by whatever cultural outlook you have. So this plan was a plan that really would, if it had been allowed to succeed, would have averted all the problems that the Bantu people of sub-Saharan Africa are facing today, because it would have meant that the social, economic, and political institutions of the states would have continued functioning as they were intended to. Okay? So, during the time of apartheid, separate developments, National Party rule in South Africa, white people had one of the highest standards of living in the world. Okay? And that's because they were using their economic system the way it was intended, which is to make money for individuals who then pay taxes to the state, which then uses that money to build bulk infrastructure and also invest in industry so that it can also draw an income. If you look at South Africa's economy today, there's very little that's being drawn into the fiscus through the state itself investing in economically productive entities. Most of the money that the South African treasury has comes from taxpayers. And then a lot of it is used in social services. It's not used to generate more money. And then policies are made that are inimical to business. For example, BEE. BEE says if a white person starts a company, they have to, before they even start working, before they even start making money, they have to hire a certain amount, a number or certain percentage of black people to work in that company. That just violates, all the principles of free enterprise and shouldn't be allowed to happen. What's more, in this country, peasant traders, you could say, like people who are in the informal economy, have a very difficult time accessing that sort of help that the government says it wants to give them so that they can actually grow their enterprises, maybe formalize, professionalize, and become more bigger contributors to the economy of this country through job creation and the payment of taxes. So we have a situation where it's very obvious that the policies of our government, because they were not in line with the civilizational culture that created the institutions through which these policies are now being played out, the fact that they were not in line with those is why we have these problems. Okay. But now, because you also have this whole thing of scapegoating the whites and the Afrikaners, we aren't able to interrogate why these problems are happening. And so when I talk about separate development, and our need to think of what it could have been if it had been given a chance, it's also an attempt to push back at the censorship which communism demands that people impose on themselves and that they actually impose on people. Luckily for us, we are living in, the post-Cold War era, where it's not so easy to just lock people in jail. Well, there are still countries where it happens. Obviously, there's Iran, where this lady who decided to strip down because she hates the oppressive dress that she has to wear as a woman there. She's been arrested. We don't know where she is. She might be dead. There's others who have been killed. In some African countries, if you oppose the government, you get shot. But in South Africa, thankfully for us, the communists here can't put us in gulags if we don't agree with them. And so I think it's very important for us to look at what is it that separate development was actually trying to achieve, right? And in its attempt to bring Black people into the mainstream of the Western capitalist system, which was basically at the heart of the South African state, they were going to make completely unnecessary this whole liberation movement. And this whole liberation movement, this was a communistic ploy to take over the state so that these parasites could have access to the state. This is what I believe, honestly. I don't think their goal really primarily was to liberate the people of this country, because if it was, then they, first of all, would not have been communist, because, in the year before Nelson Mandela was released from prison, the Berlin Wall came down, the Iron Curtain was lifted, and everyone could see for themselves the devastation that communism had wrought in the lives of the people of the USSR. They could also see how Cuba was unable to develop its economy because of communism. Now, because of this whole oppressor-oppressed victim culture that they have going on, everyone was like, oh no, Cuba would be a great country if it wasn't for the US embargo. Well, I have news for people. Rhodesia and South Africa were both under sanctions from the US and the UK and the United Nations in the case of South Africa, because of the treaty that was passed saying that that apartheid in South Africa was a crime against humanity. Because those people were economically active, economically productive, they were industrial, they were literate, they knew what to do in order to make money, the economies of South Africa and Rhodesia did not succumb to the sanctions. Okay, the economy of Zimbabwe, since Mugabe took the land from the white farmers, succumbed to the sanctions that were placed on that country. Why? Because the people of Zimbabwe had not been properly assimilated into the Western capitalist system. Mugabe and his people decided that they were going to undermine that process that would have assimilated them. And it's very much in line with the ideology that you hear espoused in June 1976, where the young people under the leadership of the communists said, we do not want education until we are liberated. Basically, no education before liberation. And this is what also happened in South Africa when COSATU was co-opted by the ANC and the SACP to be the vehicle that would put economic pressure on the state to negotiate an end to national party rule and allow the ANC to take over this country. What's interesting is that this understanding that the goals of separate development must be given a chance were actually expressed by Joe Foster, who was the General Secretary of the Federation of South African Trade Unions for SATU, and it was the biggest trade union federation in South Africa at the time. This was at the beginning of feasibility studies being done in 1982 to consider the feasibility of the creation of a mass workers' organization in South Africa to fight apartheid. Joe Foster said, instead of the goal of the formation of this trade union movement being the toppling of the National Party, the goal should rather be to put pressure on the National Party to increase the assimilation of the Bantu, San and Khoi people and the colored people, as well as the Indian people, into the mainstream economy of South Africa. And hand in hand with that, in increasing the sophistication of the education that it was providing to the Bantu, San, Khoi people, Indian people of South Africa, so that they could have the skills to actually become economically productive within the framework of the existing economic system of National Party-led South Africa. I believe that this man objectively studied the history of communism and saw what it had done and didn't want the same to happen in South Africa. Unfortunately, the South African Communist Party wasn't having it, and so conspired with an organization called the South African Congress of Trade Unions, SACTU, to infiltrate COSATU and undermine that process that had been suggested by Joe Foster, and instead insist, just like they had in June 76, no education before liberation. And so just as it's absolutely absurd to think that an airplane pilot should be able to mid-flight invite whoever from the passengers to come and fly the airplane, it's just as absurd to expect people who had not been trained to take over the social, economic, and political institutions of the state to suddenly walk into those institutions and just figure out how you're going to run them. We're talking about institutions, especially in terms of the economic institutions, and this obviously means industry and everything. These institutions come from a European civilization that has over 3,000 years of literacy, scientific development, technological advancement, and economic development based on its industrialization. This is where the Industrial Revolution started, right? So that civilization's culture has at least to be understood if you're going to take over the institutions that they've created in South Africa. And, like I said before, we were a pre-literate, pre-industrial people who had not developed the ability to acquire knowledge through the written word as a society. We had not developed industrial know-how and technological development know-how pretty much at all at this point, and so we wonder why it's so difficult for the ANC, even if they were not communists, even if they were capitalists, it was still going to be very difficult for them to run the economy of this country because it's a very sophisticated with a lot of specialized fields in it. But at least if they were capitalists, they would have been able to learn. They would have been able to assimilate capitalism. When you're a communist and you hate capitalism and your job is to undermine it, how are you going to learn? How are you going to be open to the reality that you have to learn a system that you are opposed to? And so this is why I say we need to separate from the communists. Communism is parasitic. It doesn't help anyone. You're not going to negotiate with the parasites in your body. You're going to eliminate them. And so for the good of this country, I really believe that the conversation has to be about uprooting communism as an ideology from the body politic of this country so that we can actually have economic policies drawn up by the state which support economic development, support education geared towards creating a society of economically self-sufficient people who are not dependent on the state, as is the current situation. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. I would really love to hear your comments, but please also like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Thank you.